Compound intervals. Now, an interval is compound when it is larger than an octave. Remember, every interval we've looked at so far has been no bigger than an octave. Now, compound intervals will have the same qualities as their equivalent simple intervals. Those are the ones that are not larger than an octave. Now, if you want to correlate a simple interval with a compound interval, just add the distance of an octave to the simple interval. And even though you might think that would be just a matter of adding an 8 to the simple interval, that's not really the case. The naming system we use for intervals is not as mathematically sound as that because the first interval we call it a 1 instead of a 0. It's kind of a long explanation, but suffice it to say that you need to add a number 7 to a simple interval to get the equivalent compound interval. So for example, the major third from C to E is a simple interval. But if you go from C to the higher E, the one that's an octave higher, we'll call that a tenth. And notice that major third plus 7 is 10. Now, just with simple intervals, the numeric identity of the interval is determined by just counting up from the number 1, starting with the lowest note of the interval and moving through the musical alphabet, and then ending with the highest pitch of the interval. So it's actually quite simple to figure out any interval, even the compound intervals, just by counting from the bottom note, calling it at 1, and counting up to that top note. You can see in this example that counting up a third from C gives you the same pitch as if you counted up 10. So the simple interval and its compound equivalent will always have the same quality. It's not like inverted intervals, and this is the problem that most students have. They try to convert compound intervals the way we did with inverted intervals, but that's not the case. The compound interval is essentially the same interval as its simple interval equivalent. So the major third from C to E is still a major interval, even when it is a compound tenth. We'll call them both major third, major tenth. So this is important to remember. Learning to work with compound intervals is a lot simpler than working with intervals. And when you compare the qualities of simple intervals to their compound equivalents, we'll see that the qualities are exactly the same. There's no transformation that takes place. So it's just a little trick of either adding 7 to the simple interval to discover what the compound equivalent is, or just, as I said before, you can always, just to make sure, just count them up by putting your pencil on the bottom note and counting all the lines and spaces up to the upper note, and that will always give you at least the numerical answer. Make sure you use the same quality that you would have used for the simple interval equivalent. And you can go ahead and try this. This is Check Your Understanding 22.3, in which you have to take a compound interval, reduce it down to a simple interval, the simple interval equivalent, just by taking that upper note and moving it down an octave. Then you would label the simple interval by figuring out if it's major, minor, diminished, augmented, etc. And then go back and label the compound interval. Make sure to use the same quality that you used for the simple interval.